Welcome to the GTAC Tech Talk webinar on Archiver settings and troubleshooting. My name is Derek. I'm a technical support representative with Genetec, and I will be your host for today's webinar. We also have other members of the Genetec Technical Assistance Center standing by to answer your questions during the webinar. Just type your question in the GoToMeeting console, and someone will get back to you with an answer shortly. If there are any answers that we cannot get to in the time allotted today, we'll be sure to send you an email with the answer. The questions and answers from today's webinar will be posted in the Genetec Technical Assistance Portal forum under the GTAC Tech Talk section. If you think of any question that relates to today's webinar, you can also post it in the forum and someone will get back to you with an answer. As with our previous GTAC Tech Talk webinars, we'll be posting a video of this webinar in our new videos section of the Genetec Technical Assistance Portal. Just log into the G tab, go to Tools, click on Videos, and then select the Webinars category on the left. From here, you can either watch the video directly on your web browser, or you can download a zipped version in WMV format. So I'd just like to take a minute to briefly go over the contents of today's webinar. The primary goal of today's webinar is to give you as many troubleshooting techniques as possible to solve the most common archiver issues you may run into. After the basic overview of how the archiver works, we'll go over a few of the common configuration settings, and then go into the troubleshooting section. The overview and configuration settings will only take about 10 minutes, and since we have lots of this information contained in our documentation and other webinars, and the next 30 minutes will be spent on the archiver troubleshooting tools and techniques, and then take a look at the common issues we see and what we can do to resolve them, or at least gather more information. Once we're done with the troubleshooting section, we're going to leave the webinar open for about another 10 minutes, in case you have any other questions you may want to ask. Now, our webinar today is looking specifically at the archiver service, so we're assuming viewers have a basic understanding of how Omnicast works with respect to the other services and with the client applications. Before we go into more detail on the archiving troubleshooting steps, let's take a brief look at how the archiver works. The archiver is responsible for the discovery of the IP units or cameras on the network and keeping track of their current status. The archiver handles the units through the use of extensions, which give the archiver additional information with regards to the settings, discovery, security, and priority of specific groups of units. Units are usually grouped based on the manufacturer. The archiver is in charge of the command and control of the units and cameras on the security system, as well as recording the incoming events and video streams from these units and cameras. If software motion detection is used, as opposed to motion detection being done by the video unit, the archiver performs the motion detection and handles the events gathered from any detected motion. Let's take a look at a simple network diagram to see how this is working. The command and control is done using a TCP connection to the unit, and any information with regards to the events, bookmarks, and video recorded is stored in a database specifically used by the archiver. We recommend using a unique local database for the archiver and not a shared or network database. If a common database server is being used, make sure each database has a unique name for each archiver. In a full multicast environment, the video stream is sent to both the archiver and the client applications. And this also includes the Genetec services as well. If the network only supports unicast transmissions, it will first be sent to the archiver and then sent to all the Omnicast applications from the archiver. Now, before moving on to the configuration, I just want to mention that the information previously mentioned is for the core archiver service. There are other types of archiver services that can be installed as well, such as failover and auxiliary archiving, but the scope of the topic was a little too large to be covered in one webinar. For that reason, we're going to be focusing on the base archiver service today, and if there's enough of a demand for a webinar on the additional archiving services, we'll do a follow-up webinar on the topic for you. Now, before going into some of the heavier troubleshooting techniques, I'd like to cover some of the basic archiver configuration settings. In many cases where we're having archiving issues right after the installation or a configuration change, the source of the problem can usually be found in the following configuration screens. The first place to look is in the Archiving Services General tab from the server admin. The two things to check here are that the archiver is connecting to the right gateway and that the network card is set to the correct one. If the archiver has a local gateway installed or is installed on the primary server, the gateway field can be left blank, and it will look for a gateway on its local machine. Otherwise, it should be set to the IP address or server name of the primary gateway server. In situations where you're not seeing your archiver showing up in the physical view of the config tool, take a look at the gateway setting first, and confirm that the archiver is connecting to the right gateway. The network card used for the services should be the first one in your NIC priority list in Windows. You can double-check this by running the ncpa.cpl program, go into the Advanced Settings, and then check the order. The NIC used by the services can be moved up on the list by highlighting it and using the up arrow on the side of the window. Now, in situations where you have the servers on one LAN and the cameras or units are on a separate LAN, you should have your services on the same LAN as your servers, and the archiver extensions configured to use the NIC that connects to the LAN that the cameras or units are on. If everything is on the same network, verify that the extensions are using the same NIC as the archiver. Now, still in the archiver service section of the server admin, the next thing we want to confirm is that the archiver has been set to archive video. Make sure the archive option is checked on the top of the screen here, or the archiver will not be storing video and will be used for display purposes only. The next thing to check on this screen is that the archiver is connected to a database. Take a look at the data server and the database name to make sure they are correct. We should be able to get the properties for the database by clicking on the icon here, if everything is working properly. The service the archiver is logging into Windows with must have full rights to read and write to the database, as well as to all drives used, which can be seen below the database section. This account must also be a local administrator, even if it's a domain account. Speaking of the disk used to store archive video, one of the main settings you want to check or adjust there is the minimum free space. We recommend setting this to 0.2% of the total disk space. Basically, this translates to 2 gigabytes per terabyte of storage. Anything below that, and the drive manager won't have enough space to maintain the drive, and you may see performance issues. The last thing to take a look at in here is the archiving options on the bottom here. There are a few options in here which can be configured, but the main thing we want to look for in terms of troubleshooting purposes is the top option here. If the delete oldest files when disks are full option is not checked, the archiver will simply stop archiving to a disk when it gets full. If all your disks are full, this means that no video will be recorded at all until the files pass their retention period. Ideally, you should have enough total disk space to cover the retention period set for all the units, but if the disks get full before the retention period is hit, or the automatic cleanup is not set for the units, you should have this checked so it will delete the oldest files to make space for the new incoming video. Now, just as a side note, you can set up the default retention period in this screen as well. This will only set up the retention period on the new units added and will not modify any of the existing units that have previously been added to Omnicast. Now, that's your basic configuration setup right there, but we also have some recommendations for some of the other settings. We're just going to touch on these points briefly, but if you need more information on any of this, please take a look at our previous webinars on best security practices and Omnicast installation. Now, a major concern is always the firewall. If the firewall is not properly configured, it could stop the incoming video streams from getting to the archiver service. You'll need to make sure the ports being used by Omnicast have been unblocked, as well as add any Omnicast applications to the exceptions list. For example, if you need to add the omniarch.exe application to the exceptions, you'll need to browse to the file, as it will not show up in the list of applications. To help us troubleshoot any issues happening on the server, we have a series of log files that are kept for the Genetec services. We recommend having this logging enabled for the archiver service, which can be done in the Logging tab for the archiver in the server admin. While we're checking this, I want to mention the settings for the number of days to keep the logs. Right here. Our goal is to have log files available if we encounter any problems with any of the archive video. For this reason, we recommend having the number of days set to the maximum camera retention period for the archiver. It sounds confusing, I know, but let me give you a quick example. So if we take a look at the camera retention period set up for our archiver, which can be found in the Config tool under the Archiving tab for the archiver, we want to look at the longest time on the list. So from our example, we can see that the shipping department camera here has the longest retention period of 30 days. So we should go back to the Logging tab and set this up to keep the logs for 30 days. Anything below that, and we may not have a log if we find a problem in our archive video. Now before turning on the logging, please verify that you have the disk space available for the logs as well. Another recommendation to improve the overall performance of the system is to only add the extensions for the units you need to use with the archiver. Any additional extensions will take up resources on the server. So we can see in our example here, if we had a variant unit on the system, and we've removed that unit from the archiver, and we have no other variant units, we can actually go ahead and remove that extension there. Now on the server itself, you want to make sure the latest Windows updates have been applied to the system, and the network card drivers are up to date. The time on the server is very important as well, so that you're able to pull up the right video footage. The time should be synchronized between the client and the server. With regards to the cameras, you want to make sure that you're not overloading your archiver. The total throughput on the archiver should not exceed 300 megabits per second, or 300 cameras, whichever one comes first. Now please note that the 300 megabits per second throughput limit is the sum of both the incoming and outgoing data. So if your cameras are being recorded on the archiver and the archiver is sending the video stream out to the clients, such as in a situation when we're using unicast UDP on the network, both the incoming and the one outgoing stream must be counted in the total. For the outgoing video, if two clients are viewing the same camera, you only count one stream as it's duplicated by the gateway and sent to the individual client workstations. Now the other thing you want to check for the cameras is that they're on the archiving mode and schedule that you wish to use. The schedules can be set up in the Schedule Management section of the Config tool, and this would be a good thing to check if your cameras are only recording occasionally, when they should be recording constantly on a schedule. Now that we've had a look at some of the general settings that may cause problems if not configured properly, let's start taking a look at the tools we can use to identify more complicated issues. The first are the logs from the time period when the problem was happening. The logs that we would need to look at are the main directory logs, the logs from the primary gateway, and the archiver server gateway if one is installed, as well as the archiver logs. These are text files, so if you need to send us those through email or FTP, they should compress quite a bit when they're zipped up. You can find the location of your log files by checking the Logging tab of the service in question. The next set of information that would be helpful to us are the Windows Event Viewer logs, specifically the application and system logs. You can export those from the Event Viewer in either CSV or EVT format, although CSV is easier to work with and is preferable for us if you need to send these to the Genetec Technical Assistance Center. These logs can be exported by selecting the log you wish to export, click on Action, choose Save Log As, and choose the type as either CSV or EVT. Now let's take a look at the archiver logs first, and we can find out some basic information and common problems in there. The easiest way to look at the archiver logs is through Excel. If you have it installed on your PC, you can right-click on the log file and choose to open with Excel. Once the file is opened, you can highlight the data after the header and turn on the filter from the Data tab. This will put drop-down menus in the headers where you can choose which information you want to view. This is particularly helpful in looking for specific events or events for a specific unit. If you need to find out about specific events other than the ones we're covering here, you can always search for them in the help file or the administrator's guide. Also, some of the most common ones are listed in Knowledge Base article number 193. The first type of event I'd like to mention is the entity registered event. If you see a large group of those, it usually means your archiver service has just started. You should see one of those for each unit or camera that the archiver is tracking. One of our main events that it's a sure sign of trouble is the archiving queue full message. It's a bit of a broad event, but basically what it means is that the archiver is not able to write all the packets that are being sent from the encoder or camera. This could be because the actual storage device could not write the packets fast enough, because there are not enough CPU resources to handle the packets, or it could be a problem with the archiver database. In the description field of the event, you will see the name of the camera which has generated the event. There are several things to check to find the source of the problem. The first one is our CPU resources. Take a look at the processor usage in the performance monitor of the archiver to make sure it's not going too high. You'll also want to check the available disk space and make sure we have no orphan files, which are video files that have no database entries and therefore will never be cleaned up. We can check for orphan files by going into the Archiving tab of the Archiver service in the Server admin and clicking on the last icon right here next to the database name. So we select the folders that we wish to check and we click on the Search button. This may take some time depending on how many files we have in these folders. If you do find orphan files, they can either be deleted by selecting them and click on the X on the bottom of the list here, or they can be reindexed by holding the Shift and hitting the Quarantine button, which is right next to it. Now just a quick note that when a file is reindexed, the video information is the only data that's added to the database. So none of the events or bookmarks that were originally associated with that footage will be present in the database after reindexing. Also note that like the search, the reindexing may take a long time depending on the drive size, since the archiver is busy recording the current video at the same time, and this is an extra load on the system. Now, one thing to check with respect to the drive space is the retention period that we previously mentioned here. If we're keeping the files for too long, they may be filling up the drives before the retention periods are hit. It takes more resources to clean up these files on the fly than if they are done on schedule with the retention period, so it would be better to reduce the retention period or increase the drive space to avoid this kind of situation. Once the drives have been checked, you want to make sure the archiver database is working fine as well. Similar to the orphan file search, we can also do a search on orphan database entries. This will find all entries in the database that do not have files associated with them. You can run this by holding the Shift and hitting the Find Orphan File search button here. Now the orphan database entries can be cleaned up by making sure they're selected and hitting the Delete button on the bottom of the screen. Now sometimes the issue is related to the network, and the information coming to the server cannot be handled by the network card installed on the archiver. As previously mentioned, make sure the NIC drivers are up to date first. In the network properties, we can also look for a value called Receive Descriptors. This is basically the incoming event buffer on the network card, and we can try to increase this value to see if it clears up the issue. The last possible cause of an archiving queue full event is that the external storage device used may not be able to write the data as fast as it's receiving it. This may be because the drive is being used by other applications at the same time, or a limitation on the physical hardware itself. Now, due to performance and disk space calculation issues, we should not have a drive being used by more than one archiver. If you're still getting issues with the archiving queue full events, after you've verified all this information, please send us the logs and any performance tests you can run, and we'll take a look into the issue for you. Now, a similar common event you might see in the logs is the RTP packets lost message. RTP stands for Real-Time Transport Protocol, and this basically indicates that the archiver did not receive all the expected information from the unit. We could get this message if the packets have been lost over the network, or if the CPU does not have the resources to process the packets received by the network card. In the description for this event, you will be able to see the number of packets lost since the last time you got an RTP packets lost event, which will be no more than once every minute. Now, this event is more network related than the archiving queue full message, so the first thing we'll want to look at is the network card drivers, as well as the received descriptors value we mentioned in the previous troubleshooting section. We can increase this value to try to fix the issue, giving it more buffer room. As well, take a look at the CPU resources in the performance monitor to make sure it's not maxing out and is unable to handle the packets coming from the network card. Now, the last thing you'll want to try is a network trace to check the communication between the unit and the server. Using Wireshark or a similar packet sniffer, you may be able to spot where the packets are being lost on the network. If you do not have any experience running this application or don't have a network administrator that can assist you with this, give us a call and we can help you out. Our next archiver log event that we want to keep our eyes peeled for is the transmission lost message. This event is generated when the archiver hasn't received any video packets from the unit in more than 5 seconds. The TCP command and control connection will still be active, but we're not getting anything from the video stream. The first thing to try to change is the connection type between the unit and archiver. This can be found in the Network tab for the camera itself. By default, it's set to Best Available, but we can try to force it to use Unicast UDP or the multicast stream to see if those are coming through. You can see if multicast is being supported on your network from the gateway connections. In the physical view of the config tool, click on the gateway and select your connections tab. If you have MC UDP and TCP in both the to and from columns in the gateway, you have multicast fully supported. If you do not see multicast supported, you may have the gateway configured to use Unicast in the video redirection section of the server admin. By default there it's set to automatic detection. You can also check with your IT administrator to verify if you have multicast fully supported on the network. Now, you'll also want to double check the firmware on the unit to make sure it's aligned with our tested and supported firmware. You can find that on the G tab there, under Tools, Supported Devices, and we just search for our unit. In some cases, the unit just needs to be rebooted in order to get the video stream going again. If this becomes a frequent issue and a reboot is needed quite often, give the GTAC a call and we can look into this for you. Our last step in troubleshooting a transmission lost event is to do a network trace to see where the video packets are being lost. Once again, we can help you run the trace or analyze the data if needed. Now, our last archiving log event that we're going to take a look at is the unit lost event. When we get these messages, it means that we have lost all contact with the unit. In the entity tree of either the live viewer or the config tool, you'll notice that all the devices attached to the unit will be offline and in red. This could be an indication that the unit is rebooting, which sometimes happens when a new configuration is being applied, or that the network connection to the unit has been disconnected somewhere along the way. The easiest way to test this is by running a ping test to see if we can connect to the unit from the server or not. We can also use Wireshark or another packet sniffer to run a network trace between the archiver and the unit. Another good test would be to disable recording on the unit and see if the unit comes back up. And at least we would get command and control back. You can disable recording by clicking on a camera from the logical or physical view, go to the Recording tab, and clear the check marks next to all the schedules. Now that we've had a look at the archiver logs, I'd just like to take a look at one of the Windows tools that we've mentioned which can be helpful, the Performance Monitor. It can be brought up by running perfmon, and we'll show you a graph of the pages per second, the average disk queue length, and the percentage of the processor time being used. This information can be saved and sent to us if you need more help finding out what's going on with the server. For a quick test to see if your CPU is getting maxed out, you can also check the Performance tab of the Windows Task Manager. Now, one of the tools that's honestly not very useful in self-diagnosing problems, but can be used by the GTAC to help find the source of an issue, is the Telnet console in the Watchdog. In order to have this option available to us while we're troubleshooting an issue, make sure you have Telnet available on the server PC. Now, in a case where the archiver service is terminating unexpectedly, we may also want to check for dump files. These can be set up to be created manually or generated automatically from the Watchdog. Basically, the dump files are created when the application generates a second chance exception code. To create a manual dump file, just right-click on the service in the Watchdog and choose the Create a Manual Dump. You would want to do this in a case where the service is still running. Now, in order to have the dump files created automatically, which is useful if you're not there when the unhandled exception happens, you can take a look in the G tab under Tools, then the Utilities section, expand the Genetec Tools, and look for the dump registry keys file for the version that you're using. Please make sure that you're able to modify the registry from the account you're logged in with, and to run the appropriate version, either 32 or 64-bit. There's one file for each for turning on and off the dump logs, the enable or disable here. Now, these dump files can be quite large, so don't forget to turn them off once you have the information you require. You can also zip them up before sending them to us to reduce the size. You'll want to restart the services after turning on or off the automatic dump generation. Now that we've had a look at some of the troubleshooting tools and the issues we can find with them, we're going to look at some of the most common general issues we run into and how to resolve them or at least find out the source of the issue. The three common issues we'll be looking at today are problems recording video, no audio has been stored with the archive video, and the archiver service is restarting. Starting with our first issue, problems recording video, this can be a complete lack of archived video, or it can be an unexpected or unexplained gap in the video. If you want to check how many cameras are actually archiving video at the moment, you can go into the physical view of the config tool, click on the archiver, and go to the Statistics tab. The number of cameras that are actually archiving is listed right here, but this page is not updated in real time, so you need to refresh the page first. If you want to update the number of cameras that are active and archiving without taking the time to calculate the storage space, hold the Shift and hit the refresh button down here. Once the date and time are updated on the bottom of the screen, you'll see an accurate count here. Now, the first thing to confirm for a recording issue is that the server has met the minimum requirements for hardware and software, including the database and operating system. It's especially important to double-check all the base configuration settings we went over earlier in the webinar, especially the database settings, and that the archive box is checked in the Archiving tab. If we have our camera set to on motion or manual mode, the first thing we want to check would be to see if we're getting motion on the camera at the time. So check to see if we're getting a motion on event in the archiver logs for the camera that's missing video. We can also check the event monitoring pane in the live viewer to see if the events are coming up. We can hit the eye icon on the bottom of the list here to change the filter to only show specific events. If motion is being detected on the unit, check the unit's web page to make sure it's seeing motion and sending us the events. If we're using the archiver to detect motion, check your motion settings. The three most common settings that need adjustment are the sensitivity and the on and off thresholds. From the preview screen, take a look at the green blocks that it's showing you. Now, if there's a lot of noise in the image, you need to lower the sensitivity until you only see green blocks for objects that are moving in the scene. Once you have this set up, you need to determine how many blocks should be active in order for the movement detected to count as a motion event. For example, if there's a flag in the background that's setting off a maximum of 10 motion blocks, you'll want to make sure the camera's on and off thresholds are above that level, or the flag will always be setting off unwanted motion events. You can also use zones to exclude the flag from the motion detection. The motion settings are very scene-specific, and differences in lighting and other environmental parameters can cause the same model of camera to have very different motion settings depending on the location. If you've checked the motion events and settings and they look fine, or if the camera is supposed to be recording continuously, we need to see if we're getting any errors writing to the storage devices. Now, these may show up in the archiver logs as cannot write to any drive, transmission lost, cannot write on a specified location, or other similar events. If we're seeing any of these events, take a look at your storage devices and make sure they're fully accessible by Windows using the account the services are logging in as, and also that they have the proper permission to read and write to those drives. We usually recommend logging in using the account the services are using and trying to access each device by creating and deleting a quick text file on the drive. If the storage devices all check out, we may be having a database issue, and we should check for any database lost messages. Again, this could either be a permission issue in trying to access the database, or a problem accessing the storage device the database is located on. Check the Windows Event Viewer logs as well to make sure we're not seeing any problems with SQL at the time. Now, if the archiver seems to be recording in the live viewer panes but you're not able to find video in the archive player, take a look to make sure the files are being written to the drives. If they are there, you may be having a connection problem with the archive player. So from the archive player, take a look under the Tools, and then click on Options, and from the Options window, let's go to the Network Settings. Make sure we have the right network card selected in here. If we're still not able to find the cause of the gap or lack of recording, please gather as much information about when the archiver stopped recording and any changes that may have been made to the system before this happened, and give the GTAC a call. Now we're moving on to our second most common issue, when we do not have audio recorded with the archived video. Before looking into Omnicast, we need to verify the hardware connections and confirm that we can hear audio through the unit's web page if possible. The first place to look in Omnicast is to make sure the archiver is actually configured to record audio. Go into the Recording tab of the camera in the Config tool and make sure the Record Audio parameter is set. The second thing to look at is how the microphone and the camera are associated in Omnicast. The microphone must belong to a unit which is controlled by the same archiver through the same extension as the unit the camera belongs to. It's also possible that the audio stream is not getting through to the archiver. In the Config tool, go into the Physical view and click on the microphone entity. We can go into the Network tab here and check the connection type. Depending on the network configuration, we may have to change the audio stream to Unicast UDP or Unicast TCP. Now, our last most common issue we're going to look into today is where the archiver service is restarting. In the event logs, this may show up as an application lost and restarted message on the omniarch.exe application. The first test to take a look at is in the Windows Task Manager. I want to check the CPU usage for the archiver service. If it is high, try to disable the archiving option and see if the archiver restarts while only being used for viewing and command and control. We just want to uncheck that there. In the same vein, we may want to track the memory usage of the OmniArc.exe application over time to see if we're facing a memory leak issue. Now, earlier in the webinar, we mentioned the maximum throughput of the archiver, and it must be either 300 megabits per second, and we want to double check that, especially in this case. Remember that if the archiver is sending out video streams to the clients, you need to count that in the total throughput. Now, if this is a remote archiver that is connecting to the directory service on a different PC, try to ping the directory server from the archiver server. If there's high latency between the two, we can temporarily increase the timeout value in the watchdog until the source of the latency is found. Open the watchdog tray, click on Options, and go into the Startup section here. We can change the timeout to, say, 90 seconds, for example. Now, please remember, this is a workaround until the problem can be addressed and shouldn't be used as a long-term solution. If the source of the problem is not evident from the above tests, or you need more assistance, please give the GTAC a call or send an email, and make sure to include the Omnicast, Windows, and Performance Monitor logs. It would also be a good idea to provide the dumps from when the archiver service restarts. So this concludes our troubleshooting section and the GTAC Tech Talk webinar for today. We're going to leave the webinar open for another 10 minutes or so in case you have any further questions you would like to ask our experts. If you think of any questions after we close the webinar, please feel free to post it on the GTAP forums, and we'll get back to you with an answer. The questions from today's webinar will be posted in the GTAP forums as well, and we'll have the video of the webinar up in the video section of the GTAP in a couple of days. On behalf of myself and the Genetec Technical Assistance Center, I would like to thank you very much for attending today's webinar. We hope you have a very happy and safe holiday season, and wish you all the best for the new year.